What the fire does not destroy, it reveals. Hermetic axiom. What if your childhood pain wasn't a punishment, but an initiation? What if the very family that wounded you was the gateway to the awakening you carry now? Toxic homes don't break awakened souls, they forge them, the way fire shapes metal. And once you see why you were placed in that fire, nothing about your past will look the same again. Hold this line, what comes next flips everything you've believed about your own story. There are moments in life when everything familiar collapses at once, and a person is left standing in the ashes of who they used to be. It's in that collapse that something deeper wakes up. Pain forces awareness that comfort never could, stripping away every mask that once felt necessary. And in that rawness, the real self finally begins to surface. Fire has a way of revealing what routine kept hidden. When someone can no longer rely on old roles or emotional autopilot, they start noticing truths they once avoided. They see how much of their identity was shaped by pleasing others, surviving tension, or keeping peace they never actually felt. The breakdown becomes the doorway they never would have chosen. What feels like devastation at first often becomes the moment clarity enters. In the quiet after everything falls apart, the mind begins asking new questions. What was real? What was acting? What was fear? These questions sound simple, but they change everything they touch. This is the first spark of awakening. People rarely awaken in calm seasons. They awaken in rupture, the breakup, the disappointment, the betrayal, the moment life stops cooperating with who they were pretending to be. When nothing outside feels stable, they're forced to turn inward for the first time. That inward shift becomes the beginning of wisdom. What emerges from fire is different from what entered it. The old identity burns, but what remains is stronger, cleaner, and more honest. And as soon as this inner shift begins, another force steps in, the friction that shapes everything that comes next. Friction inside a toxic family isn't the kind of discomfort someone can just get used to. It's a pressure that keeps tightening, a constant emotional noise that never truly goes silent. Sensitive souls pick up every shift in tone, every change in atmosphere, every contradiction. Living in that tension forces them to stay alert long before they understand why. This persistent pressure does something to the mind. It stops them from slipping into unconscious routines, because nothing around them is consistent enough for autopilot. They begin scanning, questioning, sensing patterns that others around them miss completely. It's an involuntary awakening, the kind that begins not from curiosity, but from necessity. Where others can afford to ignore what's happening under the surface, the sensitive one can't. The environment becomes too loud, too unpredictable, too emotionally charged to pretend everything is normal. Their awareness grows sharper out of survival, not ambition. And that sharpness becomes their first form of spiritual intelligence. Over time, this friction becomes a kind of inner training. They start noticing what triggers people, what calms them, what hides behind anger or silence. They read emotional truth the way others read facial expressions. Without realizing it, they develop a depth of perception that becomes impossible to unlearn. Insight becomes second nature. And once that insight solidifies, the next realization arrives naturally. Pain isn't just something they endure, it's something they transform. If this is hitting close to home, take a second, like the video, subscribe, and stay with me. What comes next goes even deeper. Some wounds enter a person's life quietly but settle in places nothing else can reach. They linger, they press, they irritate, and no amount of pretending makes them disappear. Sensitive souls feel this more intensely because they're not built to numb or ignore. And when a wound refuses to leave, transformation becomes the only direction left. As time passes, the mind starts building layers around that original hurt, understanding, resilience, intuition, perspective. Each layer forms not because the pain vanished, but because the person had to find a way to hold it without breaking. What began as a sharp irritation slowly becomes the center of their strength. The wound turns into material for depth. It's in small choices that the pearl begins forming. Choosing reflection over reaction. Choosing honesty over denial. Choosing growth instead of repetition. These tiny shifts accumulate quietly, shaping a version of themselves they never could have built in peace. Wisdom grows in the very place they once tried to escape. Sensitivity becomes alchemy here. Instead of letting the wound become bitterness, they refine it into empathy and insight. People around them start noticing the difference, not because they speak about their past, but because something about their presence feels grounded and clear. Hidden pain matures into visible wisdom. And once someone sees how their deepest hurt became their greatest teacher, another question rises naturally. What else in their life was shaped by distorted versions of Ov? Every family carries emotional patterns that repeat themselves quietly across generations. Most people follow these patterns without ever seeing them, but sensitive souls feel the weight of them immediately. They notice the same reactions, the same wounds, the same stories playing out in different faces. And once they see it, continuing the cycle becomes impossible. This awareness becomes a point of rupture. They start stepping back and asking questions no one else in the family ever dared to ask. Why do we love like this? Why do we communicate like this? Why does this pain keep returning? Those questions interrupt the repetition. They create a space where choice finally becomes possible. The cycle cracks. Changing the pattern doesn't come from grand gestures. It comes from everyday decisions, choosing not to yell, choosing to pause, choosing to listen, choosing not to internalize someone else's storm. These choices seem small, but each one breaks a thread in the old emotional fabric. Slowly, a new pattern starts to form. This transformation is lonely, because the family often doesn't understand what's happening. When someone refuses to participate in the old dynamics, others may resist or push back. But that resistance is actually confirmation. The system feels the shift. The one who disrupts the unconscious pattern becomes the hinge the lineage turns on. A quiet turning point. And once they realize the cycle stopped at their hands, another truth unfolds. Choosing who they become is no longer optional, it's the next step. Most people grow into adults who simply mirror what they saw growing up. They speak the same way, react the same way, and love the same way, often without realizing they're repeating someone else's script. Sensitive souls can't do that. Chaos forces them to question everything they absorbed, because imitation feels unsafe, not natural. This questioning becomes the beginning of conscious construction. Instead of running old programming, they start asking themselves, do I actually want to respond like this? Do I want to carry this habit into my life? Does this version of me feel real? Those questions create space between impulse and identity. A space where choice lives. At first, conscious choice feels heavy. It requires slowing down, noticing triggers, choosing differently when reacting would be easier. But every intentional decision rewires something. They begin shaping themselves on purpose, rather than by default. Over time, the self they're building starts to feel sturdy, grounded, and truly theirs. Old patterns begin losing power because awareness dissolves their automatic grip. A single pause can interrupt years of conditioning. A breath taken at the right moment prevents an inherited reaction from taking over. These small victories accumulate into a new emotional architecture, one they designed with clarity. Identity becomes craftsmanship. And once they experience the freedom of choosing themselves consciously, the next shift arrives naturally, the ability to see reality without the illusions they inherited. Growing up in dysfunction strips away certain illusions long before a person is ready. They learn early that love can be inconsistent, that safety isn't guaranteed, and that adults can be wounded in ways children don't understand. This early exposure forces them to see what others are protected from. And once someone sees reality clearly, they can't go back to believing comforting stories. This clarity sharpens their perception. They become attuned to tone, body language, emotional shifts, details most people never notice. What others take at face value, they read in layers. It's not overthinking, it's pattern recognition shaped by survival. Over time, this becomes an intuitive ability to sense truth beneath appearance. The challenge is that this clarity often feels isolating. They see the tension others pretend isn't there, the hurt behind someone's anger, the insecurity hiding under confidence. Even when they want to ignore it, their intuition keeps naming what's real. Living with that much awareness can make the world feel thinner, sharper, more transparent. It's a different kind of vision. But this vision becomes one of their greatest strengths. It protects them from manipulation, false intimacy, and relationships built on illusion. They know when something is off long before the evidence appears. And while this level of discernment can be uncomfortable, it also becomes a form of self-trust that can't be shaken. Truth becomes their anchor. And as they understand truth more clearly, a deeper question rises: where did all this wounded behavior begin? At some point, a sensitive soul starts noticing something others overlook. Harmful behavior doesn't appear out of thin air. It's inherited, copied, absorbed, replayed. The parent who caused pain was once a child shaped by their own storms. This realization doesn't excuse anything, but it finally explains everything. And understanding creates space where blame used to live. When they trace the emotional lineage, patterns begin revealing themselves. A grandmother who never expressed affection. A father who learned silence as survival. A mother taught that love equals control because that's all she ever saw. Generations repeating the same wound with different costumes. Seeing this broader history dissolves the illusion that the pain was personal. This perspective softens the emotional charge. Instead of thinking, "What's wrong with me?" they begin asking, "What happened to them?" That shift doesn't erase hurt, but it frees the sensitive soul from carrying guilt that was never theirs to hold. The wound stops feeling like a personal failure and starts looking like an echo they were born into. That alone is liberating. They no longer need to romanticize or demonize their family. They can observe with clarity: you acted from wounds, not from truth. And clarity, without the weight of loyalty or resentment, becomes a form of healing no one taught them was possible. It doesn't demand reconciliation, it simply gives their heart room to breathe again. Space is healing. And with that new space comes the next realization: if pain is inherited, then boundaries become the doorway to break the cycle. Growing up in chaos teaches a lesson that calm households rarely deliver. Without boundaries, love collapses into self-erasure. Sensitive souls learn this the hard way. They notice how giving too much drains them, how silence turns into resentment, and how trying to save everyone only ends up wounding themselves. That awareness becomes the seed of a different kind of wisdom. When they first start setting boundaries, it feels unnatural, even cruel. They fear being misunderstood or rejected for choosing themselves. But little by little, they see something surprising. Every no they speak strengthens their inner stability. Every pause, every limit, every moment they choose distance over chaos becomes an act of self-respect. Boundaries start feeling like oxygen. With time, they realize that boundaries don't push genuine love away. They filter out the forms of love that were never real to begin with. The people who care deepen their connection. The ones who only benefited from the lack of boundaries drift out. This sorting process is painful, but it's also clarifying. It reveals who's capable of meeting them with truth. Eventually, they understand that boundaries aren't walls, they're doorways. Doorways that lead to healthier relationships, clearer communication, and a sense of inner safety they never had growing up. Protecting their energy becomes less about fear and more about honoring the life they're building. Saying no becomes a form of saying yes to themselves. And as that inner strength forms, something else awakens, a depth of emotion and perception that only those who survived chaos can truly understand. People who grow up in calm, predictable environments often don't realize how limited their emotional range is. They've never had to navigate storms. They've never had to read the room to stay safe or interpret silence as a warning. Sensitive souls raised in chaos, though, feel everything with a different intensity. Their emotional world stretches wider, deeper, brighter, darker, because it had to. That depth becomes a kind of inner instrument. They pick up subtle shifts others miss, the way someone's tone tightens or a smile doesn't match the eyes. It's not anxiety, it's perception. Living through emotional turbulence trains them to tune into signals hidden beneath the surface. Their intuition sharpens because survival demanded it. This emotional range becomes a quiet superpower. While others struggle to understand their own feelings, the sensitive soul can name, trace, and interpret emotional currents with surprising clarity. They've lived through inner weather most people never encounter. They've learned the difference between sadness, numbness, fear, and intuition, even when those feelings overlap. Depth becomes guidance. The challenge is that deep feelers often get labeled as too much by those who can't handle depth themselves. But the truth is simple: shallow waters accuse the ocean of being dramatic. Emotional shallowness isn't strength, it's inexperience. And emotional depth isn't weakness, it's mastery earned through endurance. And that depth naturally leads to the next stage, the early search for meaning, long before most people even realize they're supposed to ask those questions. When childhood doesn't make sense, the mind starts reaching for answers long before most people even realize questions exist. Sensitive souls begin wondering why things feel off, why people say one thing and do another, why the world doesn't match the stories adults tell. That early confusion becomes the first spark of spiritual inquiry. It pushes them inward. While others drift through life on autopilot, they start observing everything with unusual precision. They notice contradictions, emotional gaps, and hidden motives. They notice how truth feels different from illusion. And because nothing around them feels stable, they begin searching for something deeper, something that actually holds. That search becomes their silent companion. This early questioning expands them. They explore books, ideas, philosophies, or simple moments of reflection while peers are still focused on surface-level living. They become thinkers before they are even teenagers, sensing that life has layers most people never touch. That quiet hunger for meaning becomes a doorway, one they walk through alone. But they walk through it anyway. And once that door opens, they discover something unexpected. If the world outside doesn't offer meaning, the inner world must be built. And that realization leads directly to the next unfolding. When the external home feels unstable, a sensitive child learns to build an inner one. They retreat into imagination, books, drawings, daydreams, or quiet observation, not because they're avoiding life, but because they're trying to survive it. That inner space becomes a sanctuary where chaos can't reach them. And slowly, it becomes more real than the world outside. In that interior landscape, creativity becomes a lifeline. They invent stories, symbols, and private meanings that help them make sense of what adults can't explain. This is where intuition begins to take shape, not as something magical, but as the natural consequence of deep inner listening. They learn to navigate emotions the way others navigate streets. Over time, this inner world becomes richly layered. It holds ideas, interpretations, insights, and quiet truths they didn't learn from anyone. It becomes a personal universe, built in secret, that lets them perceive life from angles others never see. While the outside world remains unpredictable, this inner world grows steady, warm, and trustworthy. And it stays with them for life. Eventually, they realize something profound. The inner world they built for survival becomes the very place where their true self begins to reveal itself, leading them toward the next awakening. In families where identity is shaped by control, silence, or emotional unpredictability, a sensitive soul learns early that the self they show isn't always the self they are. They sense the gap between who they must be to keep the peace and who they feel themselves becoming inside. That tension becomes the first hint that their real identity is still hidden beneath noise and expectation. As they grow, they start peeling back the layers, not all at once, but gradually, through small revelations. A moment of courage here, a boundary there, a private truth admitted quietly. Each glimpse feels like finding a fragment of a buried artifact. And the more they uncover, the more they realize those fragments have always belonged to them. It's a gentle excavation. They begin to notice which parts of their personality were inherited and which were chosen. Which beliefs were taught and which feel true. Which emotions belong to them and which were absorbed from others. This sorting process becomes a kind of inner alchemy, transforming confusion into clarity, heaviness into freedom. Identity becomes a conscious creation. And when they finally sense the shape of who they truly are, a new possibility emerges. If the self can be rediscovered, the entire family line can be healed. There comes a moment when a sensitive soul realizes they're feeling emotions their parents, grandparents, and great-grandparents never had the tools to face. The anger, fear, shame, or silence running through the family wasn't random, it was inherited, passed down like an unopened letter. And suddenly, they're the one holding it. The first one who can actually read it. Healing doesn't begin with big gestures, it begins with awareness. They start noticing the patterns that repeat through generations, the same emotional avoidance, the same explosions, the same forms of love and pain. And instead of passing those patterns forward, they stop. They breathe. They choose differently. That single moment of awareness becomes the first break in a very old chain. As they process what others suppressed, something extraordinary happens. The emotional weight of the lineage begins to dissolve. They aren't just healing themselves, they're healing the echoes behind them. The family story shifts, subtly but powerfully, because someone finally had the courage to feel what no one else could touch. Healing moves backward and forward. And once they sense that possibility, that pain can end with them, the next realization appears with stunning clarity. Even the darkest family experiences can become teachers, shaping them through contrast and awakening a deeper wisdom within. Toxic families rarely realize they're teaching anything, yet their behavior becomes one of the most powerful forms of education a sensitive soul will ever receive. By witnessing what love is not, they learn what real love must be. By seeing chaos up close, they understand the value of inner order. Pain becomes a kind of reverse map, one that guides them toward a different way of living. This curriculum isn't gentle. It arrives through contrasts, emotional shocks, and moments that force growth long before maturity should arrive. But each negative experience sharpens discernment. They begin recognizing patterns in others that most people ignore for years. They develop a radar for truth, intention, and emotional authenticity. Their sensitivity becomes wisdom. And as they get older, something unexpected happens. Instead of repeating what they witnessed, they start doing the opposite. Cruelty teaches kindness. Manipulation teaches honesty. Emotional neglect teaches presence. Everything they didn't receive becomes everything they're determined to give, to themselves and to the people they choose to love. This transformation creates a new doorway. If pain can shape them into someone more awake, then maybe love can evolve too, and that evolution leads to a different kind of attachment entirely. When love in childhood feels unstable or unpredictable, a sensitive soul learns early that clinging doesn't make people stay, it only makes them disappear faster. So they begin looking for a different way to love, one that isn't built on control, fear, or emotional bargaining. They start sensing that real love can breathe, and anything that can't breathe isn't love at all. As they heal, they realize something profound. The need to hold tightly was never about affection, it was about survival. Once safety is rebuilt inside, the urgency fades. They stop confusing intensity with intimacy, chaos with connection, sacrifice with devotion. In its place appears a softer, steadier kind of love that doesn't pull or push. It simply stands. They become people who can care deeply while remaining grounded in themselves. They don't expect another person to complete them or fill the gaps their family left behind. Instead, they bring wholeness into the relationship. That's why their love feels different, spacious, clear, honest. It's love without reenactment, without desperation, without the echo of old wounds driving the bond. And once they experience love that doesn't bind or blur, a new clarity emerges. Awakening isn't about bliss or perfection, but about seeing things exactly as they are. And that realization leads to the next step. Awakening is often sold as a promise of endless calm, but a sensitive soul discovers the truth much earlier. Awakening begins with seeing everything clearly, not feeling good all the time. It's the moment when the stories collapse, the illusions dissolve, and the behaviors of others are understood for what they are, wounded patterns, not personal attacks. Clarity, not comfort, becomes the turning point. This kind of seeing can feel harsh at first. It strips away excuses and false hopes. It shows the family's limitations with almost surgical precision. But with that precision comes freedom. Instead of wondering, what's wrong with me, they begin recognizing, this wasn't mine to carry. Self-blame fades as truth steps in to take its place. Truth is a quiet liberator. Once they stop personalizing the behavior of others, emotional space opens up inside them. Space to breathe, to feel, to choose. Their identity stops being shaped by trauma responses and starts being guided by conscious intention. This shift doesn't create bliss, it creates alignment. And alignment feels cleaner, steadier, more real than any fantasy of perpetual peace. And as they follow this clarity deeper, they discover the final movement of the journey, the rare ability to break the cycle entirely and create a new story that didn't exist before. Most people repeat the emotional patterns they inherited without ever noticing. They react the way their parents reacted, love the way their parents loved, and fear the way their parents feared. But a sensitive soul, the one who sees, feels, and questions, becomes the exception. They're the point in the family line where unconscious repetition finally meets awareness. And awareness changes everything. They begin interrupting reactions that once felt automatic. Instead of shouting, they breathe. Instead of collapsing, they reflect. Instead of repeating hurt, they pause long enough to choose differently. These tiny moments of consciousness become acts of revolution. Each choice, however small, bends the entire family story in a new direction. And as they continue choosing differently, the emotional inheritance transforms. What was once passed down as pain becomes alchemized into wisdom. The sensitive soul turns generational trauma into generational clarity. They don't just break the cycle, they rewrite it. Their children, or the people they love, receive a different world because someone finally had the courage to change the script. This is legacy. And with that, the path comes full circle. The soul who awakened through fire becomes the one who ends the fire for everyone who comes after, leading naturally into the story's opening question. Everything you lived wasn't random, it was shaping the clarity you're feeling right now. And if you carry this awareness into your next boundary, your next choice, your next conversation, your entire story begins to shift from inheritance to authorship. If this message opened something in you, subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't walk this path alone. Like and share to bring other awakened souls into the journey. And before you leave, ask yourself one honest question. Which part of your family's story ends with you, and which new one begins? When you're ready, the next video on your screen continues this awakening.